They say a photograph captures a moment in time, freezes it, preserves it, like an insect in amber, perfect and unchanging. Margaret Chen held such a photograph in her weathered hands. The edges were soft from years of handling, the colors slightly faded, but the image remained clear. A young couple stood in front of a modest apartment building in San Francisco. The woman wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself. The man's arm was around her waist, his smile wide and genuine. Behind them, visible through the apartment window, hung a small banner, "Welcome home, Mr. and Mrs. Chen." It was 1985. They were 32 and 34 years old. The world stretched before them, full of possibility and promise. Margaret traced the outline of Daniel's face with her finger, the way she'd done 1,000 times before. How young they'd been, how naive, how completely, utterly unprepared for the life that would unfold. She set the photograph down on the kitchen table and looked around her small Portland home. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The house was quiet. It was always quiet now. On the table beside the photograph sat her laptop, the screen still glowing with the email she'd received an hour ago. An email from a lawyer, an email that used words like restitution and judgment and payment in full. And next to the laptop, her phone. On the screen, frozen in terrible clarity, was a text message. A photograph, actually. A photograph of her daughter, Savannah, radiant in a wedding dress that probably cost more than Margaret's first car, standing on a beach in Hawaii, champagne glass raised, surrounded by people who weren't Margaret. 2 photographs, 40 years apart. The distance between them measured not in time, but in heartbreak. This is a story about those 40 years, about the space between hope and devastation, about a mother's love, a daughter's betrayal, and the moment when forgiveness finally runs out. But to understand the ending, we must begin at the beginning, and the beginning starts with a promise made in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and new life. Margaret met Daniel Chen at a community fundraiser for the Chinese Cultural Center in San Francisco's Chinatown. It was a warm Saturday in April 1982, and Margaret had volunteered to help serve dim sum. She'd grown up helping in her parents' restaurant, so the work was second nature, moving efficiently between tables, remembering orders, offering recommendations with a practiced smile. Daniel had caught her attention not because he was particularly handsome, though he was, in a quiet way, tall for a Chinese man of his generation, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with precision and care. No, what caught Margaret's attention was what he was doing. While everyone else was eating, chatting, networking, Daniel sat alone at a corner table covered in napkins. But he wasn't eating from them. He was writing on them. Calculations, formulas, diagrams that looked like engineering blueprints sketched in ballpoint pen. "The dim sum isn't meant for mathematical proofs," Margaret had said, approaching his table with a fresh pot of tea. He'd looked up, startled, then embarrassed. A flush crept up his neck. "I'm so sorry. I'm supposed to be calculating the raffle odds for the fundraising committee, and I got a bit carried away." "A bit?" Margaret gestured at the table, now covered in at least 20 napkins filled with numbers and symbols. Daniel laughed then. It was a good laugh. Warm, self-deprecating, real. "I'm Daniel," he'd said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but gentle. "Margaret Wu," she'd replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but gentle. "And if you're trying to calculate raffle odds, you're doing it the hard way. My father ran numbers for the restaurant for 30 years. I could probably help." She'd sat down. They'd worked through the calculations together, Margaret translating her father's practical arithmetic into Daniel's theoretical frameworks. By the time they'd finished, the fundraising was winding down, and they'd barely noticed. "Can I take you to dinner?" he'd asked as they stood to leave, "to thank you for the help, and to apologize for monopolizing your time when you were supposed to be working." Margaret had said yes. That dinner turned into a walk through North Beach. The walk turned into a second date. The second date turned into a third, a fourth, a 100th. They discovered they both loved old movies, Daniel for the cinematography, Margaret for the costumes. They both enjoyed long walks without destinations. They both believed in working hard and living simply. Daniel was a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing firm in Oakland. He'd immigrated from Taiwan at age 12, put himself through college working nights at a print shop, and carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd earned everything he had. Margaret worked in her parents' restaurant while taking classes at San Francisco State, studying business administration with dreams of eventually opening her own shop, maybe alterations and tailoring, making use of the sewing skills her grandmother had taught her. They were both practical people. Neither believed in fairy tales or grand romantic gestures, but they believed in each other, in partnership, in building something solid and real. Daniel proposed 14 months after they met. They were sitting on a bench in Golden Gate Park, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. He'd pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket and opened it without preamble. "Margaret Wu," he'd said, "I don't have much money. I can't promise you luxury or ease, but I can promise you that I will work hard every day to build a good life with you. I will respect you, I will support your dreams, and I will love you for as long as I'm breathing. Will you marry me?" The ring was small, a simple gold band with a modest diamond that Daniel had saved 6 months to buy. Margaret had cried when she said yes, not because the ring was small, but because it represented something so much larger than itself. It represented Daniel's sacrifice, his thoughtfulness, his commitment. They married 3 months later in a simple ceremony at a community hall. Margaret's dress was one she'd made herself, working late into the night for weeks to get every seam perfect. Daniel wore a suit borrowed from his older brother. The reception featured food from Margaret's parents' restaurant and a cake made by Daniel's aunt. It wasn't lavish, it wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs, built on love and intention and the promise of a shared future. That night, after the guests had left and they'd returned to their small rented apartment in the Sunset District, Daniel had pulled Margaret close. "Someday," he'd whispered, "when we have children, I want to give them what we didn't have. I want them to start their lives without the struggles we faced. I want them to know that we built something for them." "We will," Margaret had promised. "Together we will." She'd meant it. They both had. How could they have known that promises, like photographs, can fade with time? That the children you raise with love and sacrifice can grow into strangers? That the future you're building might one day be demolished by the very hands you held through childhood? But that knowledge was still years away. For now, they were young and hopeful and in love. For now, everything was possible. Savannah Rose Chen entered the world on a rainy Tuesday morning in November 1985, 3 years after Margaret and Daniel's wedding. Margaret had been in labor for 14 hours, and by the time their daughter finally arrived, both parents were exhausted. But the moment Daniel held Savannah for the first time, all the exhaustion melted away. Margaret would never forget the look on his face. Wonder, awe, terror, love, so intense it was almost painful to witness. He'd stood beside Margaret's hospital bed, cradling their daughter with the careful reverence of someone holding something impossibly precious and impossibly fragile. "She's perfect," he'd whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Margaret, she's absolutely perfect." Savannah had her father's nose and her mother's eyes, a thick shock of black hair, tiny fingers that gripped Daniel's thumb with surprising strength. She was 7 pounds, 3 ounces of potential and promise. That first night in the hospital, after the nurses had taken Savannah to the nursery and Margaret had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Daniel had sat in the chair beside her bed, unable to sleep himself. His mind was racing with thoughts of the future, of responsibility, of all the ways this tiny person would depend on them. He'd pulled out the small notebook he always carried, the one he used for calculations and reminders, and began to write. Savannah's Future Fund started November 19th, 1985. Underneath, he'd done calculations, his salary, their expenses, what they could realistically save each month if they were careful, if they were disciplined. He decided on $50 a month to start. It didn't sound like much, but compound interest over 18 years, assuming Savannah married around 25, would add up. He'd worked out the math 3 times to be sure. In 18 years, if they never increased the amount, never touched it, let it grow with even modest interest, that $50 a month would become over $15,000. But Daniel had plans to increase it. As his salary grew, as they paid off debts, as Margaret's alteration business expanded, the fund would grow with them. The next morning, when Margaret woke up, Daniel was gone. She'd panicked for a moment, but a nurse told her he'd stepped out briefly. He'd returned an hour later with papers from the bank. "I opened an account," he'd said, sitting on the edge of her bed and showing her the paperwork, "for Savannah's wedding. So when the time comes, she won't have to worry. She'll be able to have whatever kind of wedding she wants." Margaret had looked at the documents, seen Daniel's careful handwriting on the deposit slip. $50. The first installment on a promise. "Daniel, we can barely afford." "We'll make it work," he'd said firmly. "Our parents couldn't do this for us. We had to scrape together every penny for our wedding. I don't want that for Savannah. I want her to start her marriage with joy, not stress about money. I want to give her that gift." Margaret had taken his hand, squeezed it tight. "Then we'll do it together." And they had. Over the following months and years, the wedding fund became a sacred thing in the Chen household. Every payday, before any other bills were paid, money went into Savannah's account. Some months it was $50. Some months, when Daniel worked overtime or Margaret landed a big alterations job, it was more. They never told Savannah about it, not when she was young. The fund was their secret, their surprise, their way of showing love through action rather than words. Margaret started her own alterations business from their spare bedroom when Savannah was 6 months old. She'd spread the word through community networks,
offering quality work at reasonable prices. Soon she had regular clients, people who needed hem adjusted, dresses taken in, suits tailored. The work was meticulous and time-consuming, but Margaret didn't mind. Every dollar she earned beyond their living expenses went straight into the wedding fund. Daniel took on weekend shifts at the plant, volunteered for holiday overtime, took on consulting projects in the evenings, working at their kitchen table while Savannah slept, calculating stresses and load capacities for other firms. His back would ache, his eyes would burn, but he'd look at that bank statement each month and smile.
"We're up to $23,000, he'd tell Margaret one evening when Savannah was 5 years old. "Can you believe it? $23,000. "You're going to work yourself to death," Margaret had said, worry creeping into her voice. "Daniel, slow down. We have time." "I know," he'd replied, pulling her close, "but I want to do this. Every time I make a deposit, I imagine her wedding day. I imagine her walking down the aisle without a single worry about cost, knowing her parents took care of everything. That image, it makes every extra shift worth it." Margaret had understood. She felt the same way. They were building something, not just a fun, but a foundation, a safety net, a gift of freedom for their daughter. Savannah was a bright child, quick to laugh, curious about everything, full of energy that sometimes exhausted their parents, but more often delighted them. She'd inherited Daniel's intelligence and Margaret's artistic sensibility. By age 4, she could count to 100 in both English and Mandarin. By age 6, she was reading chapter books and drawing elaborate pictures that Margaret would pin to the refrigerator. The Chen family lived modestly. Their apartment in the Sunset District was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely big enough for their small table, but it was clean and warm and filled with love. Margaret sewed most of Savannah's clothes, creating dresses and outfits that were unique and beautiful. Other children wore mass-produced items from department stores. Savannah wore one-of-a-kind pieces, each one crafted with care. Daniel built things for his daughter, a bookshelf for her growing collection of stories, a step stool so she could reach the bathroom sink, a dollhouse that took him 8 months to complete, working on it late at night after Savannah had gone to bed. The dollhouse was a work of art, 3 stories with doors that actually opened, windows fitted with real glass, tiny furniture Daniel had crafted from wood scraps and fabric remnants from Margaret's sewing. He'd presented it to Savannah on her 7th birthday. Margaret still remembered the look on her daughter's face, pure, unfiltered joy. "Daddy, you made this? For me?" "For you," Daniel had confirmed, kneeling down to her level. "Do you like it?" Savannah had thrown her arms around his neck and squeezed tight. I love it so much. Thank you, Daddy." Those were good years. Hard years, certainly. Money was always tight, time was always scarce, but good years nonetheless. The wedding fund continued to grow. By the time Savannah was 10, it had reached $42,000. Daniel had gotten a promotion to senior engineer, which came with a salary increase. Margaret's alteration business had expanded to the point where she was turning away clients, booked months in advance. They could have used that money for so many things: a bigger apartment, a new car to replace the aging Honda that was constantly breaking down, a real vacation instead of weekend trips to state parks. But they didn't touch it, wouldn't even consider it. "This is for Savannah's future," Daniel would say whenever Margaret suggested maybe, just maybe, they could borrow a little for something they needed. "We don't touch this, ever. This is sacred." When Savannah turned 13, they finally told her about the fund. It was her birthday dinner, just the 3 of them at Margaret's parents' restaurant, where Margaret's mother had prepared all of Savannah's favorite dishes. After the meal, after the cake, Daniel had pulled out the latest bank statement and slid it across the table. "Savannah, your mother and I want to show you something." Savannah had picked up the paper, her teenage brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this?" "It's a savings account," Margaret explained gently. "Your father opened it the day you were born. It's for your wedding, so when you get married someday, you won't have to worry about the cost. You can have whatever kind of wedding you want." Savannah's eyes had widened as she looked at the balance. $53,000. This is all for me? For my wedding?" "Every penny," Daniel confirmed, his voice warm with pride. "We've been saving for 13 years. By the time you're ready to get married, there should be well over $100,000. Maybe more if we keep adding to it." Margaret had expected joy, gratitude, maybe tears of happiness. Instead, Savannah had looked at the number and said, "Why didn't you use this for a bigger house? Madison's family just moved into a place with a pool." The words had landed like a slap. Daniel had blinked, confused. "What? We live in this tiny apartment and you've been hoarding all this money? Madison's house is huge. They have a pool and a game room. We could have had that." Margaret had felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Savannah, this money is for your future, for your special day. Your father and I wanted to give you that gift." "But I don't even have a boyfriend," Savannah had interrupted.
I might not get married for like 15 years, and in the meantime, we're stuck in a cramped apartment when we could be living better now. Daniel had looked like he'd been punched. His face had gone pale, his eyes confused and hurt. Savannah, sweetheart, we saved this for you because we love you, he'd said quietly, because we wanted you to have opportunities we didn't have. Don't you understand what this represents? Savannah had shrugged, 13 years old and already the gesture that would become her trademark, a casual dismissal of other people's efforts, other people's sacrifices. I guess. Thanks. Then she picked up her phone and started texting someone. Margaret and Daniel had exchanged a look across the table, a look that said, what just happened? When did our grateful, loving daughter become this? But they told themselves it was just a phase. Teenagers were self-centered. It was normal. She'd grow out of it. They were wrong. The teenage years brought changes. Some were expected, mood swings, a desire for independence, occasional rebellion. But other changes were more troubling. Savannah developed a sense of entitlement that grew like a weed, choking out the gratitude and humility her parents had tried to cultivate. When she was 14, she demanded designer jeans like her friends wore. When Margaret had explained they couldn't afford $100 jeans, Savannah had screamed at her. Everyone at school has them. Everyone. I'm the only one wearing cheap clothes. Do you want me to be a loser? Your clothes aren't cheap, Margaret had said, trying to keep her voice calm. I make them for you. Each piece is unique, made with care. They're homemade. That's the same as cheap. God, Mom, why can't you just be normal and buy me regular clothes like everyone else's parents? Margaret had stood there, needle and thread still in her hand from the blouse she'd been hemming for Savannah, and felt tears sting her eyes. Later that night, Daniel had found her in their bedroom crying quietly. She didn't mean it, he'd said, holding her. She's young. She doesn't understand yet how much effort you put into everything you do for her. When will she understand? Margaret had asked. When will she appreciate what we sacrifice for her? Daniel had no answer. When Savannah was 16, it was the car. Daniel and Margaret had saved for months, outside of the wedding fund, of course, to buy Savannah a car for her birthday, a reliable used Honda Civic. 5 years old, well-maintained, perfect for a teenage driver. Savannah's friend Madison had gotten a BMW for her 16th birthday. Brand new, midnight blue, premium sound system. When Savannah saw the Honda, her face had fallen. This is it? This is my car? It's a great car, Daniel had said, his pride evident. He'd spent weeks researching, inspecting different options, negotiating the best price. The previous owner barely drove it. It's got low mileage, excellent safety ratings. It's a Honda, Savannah had said flatly. Madison's family has different financial circumstances, Margaret had tried to explain. We got you the best car we could afford. You have $50,000 sitting in a bank for a wedding I might never have, but you can't buy me a decent car? That makes no sense. The argument that followed had been brutal. Savannah had accused them of being cheap, of not loving her enough, of prioritizing some imaginary future over her happiness now. She'd slammed doors, refused to speak to them for 3 days, made passive-aggressive comments about the car for months afterward. Daniel had been devastated. He'd sat at the kitchen table that night, his head in his hands. I don't understand, he'd said to Margaret. We're giving her everything we can. Why isn't it enough? Why is she always comparing what we give her to what other people have? Margaret had no answer then. She wouldn't have an answer for years to come. When Savannah was 17, the situation escalated. She'd applied to colleges, and her top choice was an expensive private university on the East Coast. When she got accepted, she'd been thrilled, until she saw the financial aid package. Even with scholarships, the remaining cost was more than they could afford without taking on significant debt. Daniel and Margaret had sat her down to discuss alternatives. State schools, community college for the first 2 years, then transferring. Options that would leave her with less debt, more flexibility. Savannah had exploded. You've been saving money my entire life, and now when I actually need it for something important, you won't use it? College is more important than some stupid wedding. The money is specifically for your wedding, Daniel explained patiently. It's in a designated account with specific purpose. We can't just... You won't. You mean you won't. Because you care more about some tradition than about my education. Fine. I'll just go to the cheap state school and end up with a cheap degree and a cheap life because my parents are too selfish to help me. She'd stormed out and spent the night at Madison's house. That night, Margaret and Daniel had their first real argument about the wedding fund. Maybe we should, Margaret had said quietly. Maybe college is more important. Maybe we should use some of it to help her. No. Daniel's voice had been firm, harder than Margaret had ever heard it. We cannot set this precedent. We told her this money was for her wedding. If we use it for something else now, it becomes a blank check for anything she wants. And Margaret, there will always be something else. Always something newer, better, more expensive that she decides she needs. But her education... We'll be fine at a state school. Margaret, you and I both went to state schools. We did just fine. This isn't about education. This is about her wanting what Madison has. And Madison's parents have money we don't have. We need to teach Savannah to be content with what we can provide, to be grateful. If we give in now, we're teaching her that if she complains loudly enough, long enough, she'll get what she wants. Margaret had known he was right, but it hadn't made it any easier. Savannah had gone to the state school. She'd punished them for it by barely speaking to them her freshman year. She'd come home for winter break and spent most of it at friends' houses. She'd made comments about how much better her roommates' parents treated her, how they'd bought them a new laptop and sent care packages every week. The wedding fund had reached $70,000 by then, and with every deposit, Margaret had felt a growing sense of dread rather than joy.
What were they building? What were they saving for? Was this really about giving their daughter a beautiful wedding, or had it become something else? A symbol of their sacrifice that Savannah would never appreciate? A treasure chest that their daughter saw not as a gift, but as money she was entitled to, that her parents were selfishly withholding from her other wants? But Daniel had remained committed, devoted to the vision he'd had that first night in the hospital, and Margaret had loved him too much to fight him on it. The fund continued to grow, and the distance between Savannah and her parents grew with it. Daniel Chen's heart attack happened on a Thursday afternoon in March. He was 56 years old. He'd been at work consulting on a design for a new manufacturing system when the pain started, a tightness in his chest, radiating discomfort down his left arm, difficulty breathing. His coworkers had called 911 immediately. By the time Margaret got the call and rushed to the hospital, Daniel was in the cardiac unit, hooked up to monitors that beeped and hummed, surrounded by doctors discussing treatment options. The diagnosis was cardiomyopathy. His heart muscle had weakened, was struggling to pump blood efficiently. The cause was multifactorial, the cardiologist explained. Genetics, stress, lifestyle. But Margaret knew the real cause. Years of overtime, decades of double shifts. The physical toll of working himself to exhaustion to provide for a family that never seemed satisfied. Daniel survived the heart attack, but the damage was done. He needed to reduce stress, the doctor said. Cut back on work hours, no more overtime. Rest, relaxation, lifestyle changes. Daniel had nodded at all of this, agreeing with the doctors, but Margaret saw the worry in his eyes, saw him doing calculations in his head. Less work meant less income. Less income meant they couldn't maintain their contributions to the wedding fund. "Daniel, forget the fund," Margaret had said when they were alone in his hospital room. "Your health is more important than any amount of money." "I'm not forgetting it," he'd replied, his voice weak but determined. "I'm fine. This was just a warning. I'll be more careful." But he wasn't fine. Over the next 3 years, his condition slowly deteriorated. He tried to hide it, tried to maintain his usual schedule, but Margaret saw the signs. The exhaustion that came earlier each day, the chest pains he tried to wave off as indigestion, the breathlessness after climbing stairs. Savannah was in her sophomore year of college during Daniel's first heart attack. She'd come home immediately when Margaret called, had seemed genuinely worried, but within a week she was back at school, and her calls home became less frequent. When she did call, she rarely asked about her father's health. Instead, she'd talk about herself, her classes, her social life, the study abroad program she wanted to do, which of course required more money than the family could afford. Daniel never complained about her lack of attention, never mentioned how her disinterest hurt him. He'd just sit in his recliner in their living room, watching old movies, making deposits into the wedding fund when he could, even though Margaret begged him to stop. "It's up to $74,000 now," he'd say with satisfaction. "By the time she's ready to marry, it'll be over $100,000 for sure. She'll have the most beautiful wedding, Margaret. Everything perfect." Margaret didn't have the heart to tell him that their daughter would probably complain that $100,000 wasn't enough, that she'd find a way to make it about what they hadn't given her rather than what they had. The second heart attack came when Daniel was 59. It happened at home this time, on a Sunday morning. Margaret had found him collapsed in the bathroom, barely conscious. The ambulance ride felt like an eternity. Margaret held Daniel's hand, watching the paramedics work, praying to God she wasn't sure she believed in. At the hospital, the news was grave. Significant damage. His heart was failing. He needed surgery, a complex procedure with serious risks. "We'll do everything we can," the surgeon had promised, "but you need to understand, given the condition of his heart, the odds of complications are high." Savannah had flown home immediately when Margaret called. She'd sat in the surgical waiting room, her face pale and frightened, looking younger than her 21 years. "He's going to be okay," she'd said, more to herself than to Margaret. "He has to be okay." Margaret had wanted to reassure her, to be strong, but she had no reassurances left to give. The surgery took 8 hours. For 8 hours, Margaret and Savannah sat in the waiting room, surrounded by the worried families of other patients, drinking bad coffee and trying not to imagine the worst. When the surgeon finally emerged, his face told the story before his words did. "I'm so sorry," he'd said. "We did everything we could, but there were complications. His heart was weaker than we realized. He didn't survive the surgery." The world had stopped. Margaret heard the words, understood their meaning, but couldn't process them, couldn't accept them. Daniel was gone. Her husband of nearly 30 years, her partner, the father of her child, the man who'd worked himself to death trying to provide for a daughter who barely seemed to notice. Gone. Beside her, Savannah had started crying, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Margaret had put her arm around her daughter, pulling her close, and they cried together, united in grief, united in loss. It was the last time they'd be truly united about anything. Daniel Chen's funeral was held on a gray Saturday in March. The service was at the same community hall where he and Margaret had gotten married 30 years earlier. In a way, that felt fitting. Their lives together had come full circle. The hall was packed. Daniel had been well liked in the community, known for his quiet generosity, his willingness to help anyone who needed it, his dedication to his family. Former colleagues spoke about his brilliance as an engineer. Neighbors talked about how he'd helped fix their cars, their appliances, their problems. Friends shared stories of his kindness, his humor, his loyalty. Margaret sat in the front row, Savannah beside her, and listened to these testimonials about the man she'd loved. Every word was true. Daniel had been all of those things and more. She chose to have an open casket. Daniel looked peaceful, dressed in his best suit, the one he'd bought for Savannah's high school graduation. His face was relaxed in a way it rarely had been in life. No more stress, no more pain, no more exhaustion. Margaret had leaned down to kiss his forehead before the service began. "I love you," she'd whispered. "I will always love you. Thank you for 30 beautiful years." During the service, Savannah had delivered a eulogy. She'd written it herself, had practiced it the night before, her voice breaking as she read it aloud to Margaret. Now, standing at the podium, she spoke about her father, about how he'd built her that dollhouse, about how he taught her to ride a bike, running alongside her until she found her balance, then letting go and watching her fly, about how he'd helped her with math homework, his patience endless as he explained concepts she struggled with, about how he'd believed in her, always. It was beautiful, heartfelt, genuine. For a moment, Margaret saw her daughter as she used to be, before the entitlement, before the constant comparisons and complaints. She saw the little girl who'd hugged Daniel's neck and told him she loved him, the child who'd been grateful and sweet and kind. Where had that child gone? After the service, after the burial, after the reception where people offered condolences and shared more memories, Savannah had pulled Margaret aside. "Mom, we need to talk about Dad's affairs. The accounts, the house, all of it." Margaret had blinked, still numb with grief. "Savannah, your father just... Can we not do this right now?" "I know it's hard," Savannah had said, her voice gentler than it had been in years. "But we need to be practical. You'll need help managing everything. I can help you go through the paperwork, figure out what accounts there are, what needs to be closed or transferred. Your father kept everything organized," Margaret had said quietly. "I know where everything is. I'll handle it." "Are you sure? Because I don't mind." "I'm sure." Looking back, Margaret realized that should have been the first warning sign. Savannah's sudden interest in her father's accounts, her eagerness to help with paperwork, her questions about what Daniel had left behind. But at the time, Margaret had interpreted it as daughterly concern, as Savannah trying to be helpful during a difficult time. She'd been wrong about that too. After Daniel's death, Margaret moved from San Francisco to Portland. The decision was partly practical. The Bay Area had become prohibitively expensive, and her alteration business could operate from anywhere. But it was also partly emotional. Too many memories haunted their apartment. Every corner held ghosts of Daniel. His chair, his workbench, the kitchen table where he'd done his calculations. Plans that would never happen now. She'd cried as she packed, grief hitting her in waves. But she'd also felt something else, a strange sense of relief. For the first time in 30 years, she wasn't worried about Daniel working too hard, wasn't watching him push himself to exhaustion. He was at rest now, finally, completely at rest. The wedding fund, now under Margaret's sole control, had reached $76,000. Margaret had briefly considered closing it, redistributing the money into other accounts, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. The fund was Daniel's legacy, his dream for their daughter. She would honor it. She added Daniel's name to the account title, the Daniel and Margaret Chen Wedding Fund for Savannah. Seeing his name there brought her comfort. He was still part of this, still watching over their daughter, even from beyond. Margaret set up her alteration business in the spare bedroom of her new Portland house. She let her old San Francisco clients know about the move, and many of them continued to mail items to her for alterations. She also gradually built up a new local clientele. The work kept her busy, kept her hands occupied, kept her mind from dwelling too long on loss. She'd work late into the night sometimes, the hum of her sewing machine a familiar meditation. Savannah visited regularly at first, once a week, then every other week, then monthly. The visits were pleasant enough, lunch out, maybe a walk around the neighborhood, casual conversation about Savannah's job and dating life. But Margaret noticed something. During these visits, Savannah's eyes would wander, would linger on Margaret's possessions, the family heirlooms that Margaret had brought from San Francisco.
The Royal Worcester China Service. 12 place settings of fine bone china, hand-painted with delicate floral patterns. It had been Daniel's grandmother's, passed down through 2 generations before coming to Margaret and Daniel on their wedding day. The Irish lace tablecloth, 6 feet long, with intricate patterns tatted by hand by Margaret's great-grandmother, a work of art that had taken 2 years to complete. The pearl necklace, 3 strands of perfectly matched Akoya pearls that Daniel had saved for months to buy Margaret for their 10th anniversary. The sapphire ring that had belonged to Daniel's mother, a stunning piece with a square-cut Ceylon sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. The collection of crystal,
Vases, bowls, and decorative pieces accumulated over years, some inherited, some gifted, each one with its own story. Margaret kept these items in a china cabinet in her dining room. She didn't use them often. They were too precious, too fragile. But she liked having them visible, liked being able to look at them and remember the people who'd owned them, the occasions they'd marked. During her visits, Savannah would pause by the cabinet, would look at the items with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. "These are so beautiful," she'd say. "I remember playing with the crystal when I was little. You used to tell me to be so careful." "They're delicate," Margaret would reply, "meant to be treasured." "They'll be mine someday," Savannah would say. Not a question, a statement of fact. "Someday," Margaret would confirm. "When I'm gone, they'll go to you." She meant it as reassurance, as a promise that her daughter would inherit these family treasures, would carry on the legacy. But Savannah's expression when she looked at the heirlooms wasn't one of appreciation for their history or gratitude for the promise of eventual ownership. It was something else, something that made Margaret vaguely uncomfortable, though she couldn't articulate why. Possession, calculation, assessment of value. Margaret told herself she was imagining things, that grief was making her see shadows where there were none. Savannah was her daughter, her only child. Of course she'd appreciate these family heirlooms. Of course she'd treasure them. 2 years after Daniel's death, Savannah approached Margaret with a suggestion. "Mom, I've been thinking about your legal affairs. Do you have a will? A healthcare directive? What happens if something happens to you?" Margaret had waved off the concern. "I'm only 68, Savannah. I'm healthy. There's time for all that." "Dad was only 59, Savannah had said quietly, and he thought he had time too. The words had hit Margaret like a physical blow. Savannah so rarely mentioned Daniel. For her to bring him up now, to use his death as an argument. "You're right," Margaret had said softly. "You're absolutely right. I should get my affairs in order, just in case." "I can help you," Savannah had offered. "I have a friend who's a lawyer. She does estate planning. I could set up a consultation for you." Margaret had been touched by Savannah's concern, by her initiative. "That would be wonderful, sweetheart. Thank you." The consultation had been scheduled for the following week. Savannah's friend, Jennifer, was a polished woman in her mid-30s, with an efficient manner and a professional smile. They'd met at Jennifer's office, Savannah accompanying Margaret for support. Jennifer had walked Margaret through the basics: a will to determine how her assets would be distributed, a healthcare directive to specify her wishes for medical treatment if she became incapacitated, and a power of attorney, which would allow someone to make financial and legal decisions on her behalf if she was unable to do so herself. "Who do you want to name as your power of attorney?" Jennifer had asked. Margaret had looked at Savannah. "Well, my daughter, of course. She's my only family." "That's very common," Jennifer had said. Now, there are different types of power of attorney. A limited POA, which only covers specific situations and specific timeframes, or a general durable POA, which is broader and remains in effect even if you become incapacitated. The terminology had been confusing. Margaret's head had spun with the legal jargon. "What would you recommend?" she'd asked. "For most people in your situation, a general durable POA makes sense. It provides the most protection and flexibility. If you're in the hospital and can't make decisions, or if you develop dementia or other cognitive issues, your daughter would be able to manage your affairs and ensure everything is taken care of." It made sense at the time. Savannah was her daughter. If something happened, of course she'd want Savannah to be able to access accounts, pay bills, handle necessary transactions. Jennifer had prepared the documents, a stack of papers, each one requiring Margaret's signature and initials. "Read through everything carefully," Jennifer had advised. "Make sure you understand what you're signing." But the documents had been dense with legal language. Whereas and hereafter and pursuant to, Margaret's eyes had glazed over trying to parse the meaning. "It's standard," Savannah had reassured her, sitting beside her. "Jennifer does this all the time, right, Jen?" "Absolutely," Jennifer had confirmed. "These are standard estate planning documents. I use the same templates for all my clients." Margaret had signed, page after page, her hand moving automatically, trusting in her daughter's friend's expertise, trusting in her daughter's guidance. She'd walked out of that office feeling responsible, like she'd done the grown-up thing, taking care of her affairs so Savannah wouldn't be burdened if something happened. She had no idea what she'd actually done. No idea that buried in those documents, in the fine print she hadn't fully understood, was a power of attorney that gave Savannah authority over all of Margaret's financial accounts, not just in case of incapacity, not just for specific purposes. Immediate authority, broad authority, authority Savannah could exercise at will. Margaret had unknowingly handed her daughter the keys to her entire financial life, and Savannah had accepted them with a smile. The call came on a Tuesday evening in April. Margaret was at her sewing machine, working on a hem, when her phone rang. Savannah's name lit up the screen. "Hello, sweetheart." Mom, I have the most incredible news." Savannah's voice was high with excitement, breathless with joy. Margaret smiled, setting down her work.
What is it? I'm engaged. Derek proposed last night. For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. Her mind flooded with emotions, happiness, anticipation, and something that felt oddly like relief. Finally, after all these years, all this saving, all this sacrifice, the moment had arrived. Oh, Savannah, that's wonderful. Congratulations, sweetheart. Tell me everything. And she did. The words tumbled out in an excited rush. Derek was a project manager at a software company. They'd been dating for 8 months. Margaret vaguely remembered Savannah mentioning him a few times, but she hadn't realized how serious it had gotten. He took me to Multnomah Falls, she gushed. We hiked up to the bridge, and the sun was setting, and he got down on one knee right there with the waterfall behind us. It was so romantic, Mom. So perfect. What's he like? Margaret asked. This Derek. Tell me about him. He's amazing. Successful, ambitious, kind. He treats me so well, Mom. You'll love him. When can I meet him? Soon. I'll bring him by this weekend. But Mom, I have so much to tell you about the wedding plans. I've been dreaming about this my whole life. Margaret's heart swelled. Tell me everything you're envisioning. Whatever you want, sweetheart. You know about the fund your father and I built. It's been waiting for this moment. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Brief, but noticeable. Right, the fund. Actually, Mom, I need to talk to you about that. Of course. When you're ready, we can sit down and go through the finances together. The fund has grown quite a bit over the years. With your father's contributions and mine, plus the interest and investments, it's up to... Actually, Savannah interrupted. I've already looked into it. I checked the account balance online. Margaret frowned. How did you... I didn't give you the login information. Oh, I got it sorted through the bank. Since I'm your POA, they were able to give me access to your accounts, for estate planning purposes. Something cold crept up Margaret's spine. Why would you need access for estate planning purposes? Just to understand the full financial picture, Mom. Don't worry about it. Anyway, the balance is at $78,400, right? Yes, that sounds right. I haven't checked the most recent statement, but... Perfect. That's perfect. I'll need full access to withdraw it for the wedding expenses. The words were casual, matter of fact, but they made Margaret's stomach clench. Well, of course, when you're ready to start making purchases, we can transfer the funds to your account, or set up a joint account for wedding expenses, or however you'd like to handle it. I'm happy to help you plan everything, sweetheart. That's what the money is for. Great. I'll handle the logistics. You don't need to worry about any of it. But I'd like to be involved, Margaret said gently. I want to help you plan. This is such an exciting time, and I've been waiting for this moment for... Mom, you don't need to do anything. I've got it under control. Just trust me, okay? I'll make sure everything is perfect. They talked for a few more minutes, Savannah describing her vision. A beach wedding. Somewhere warm. Somewhere beautiful. Margaret had listened, asked questions, tried to engage. But something felt off. Savannah's tone was strange, evasive. She was excited about the wedding, but oddly reluctant to discuss the actual planning with Margaret. When they hung up, Margaret sat at her sewing machine for a long time, not working, just thinking. She told herself she was being paranoid, that Savannah was just excited and wanted to surprise her, that everything was fine. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings she didn't want to hear. Derek came to dinner that Saturday. He was pleasant enough, tall, clean-cut, with a firm handshake and a professional smile. He worked in tech, made good money, had plans to climb the corporate ladder. They and Savannah were well matched in that regard, both ambitious, both image-conscious, both very aware of how they presented themselves to the world. Margaret made a special dinner, her famous braised short ribs, Daniel's favorite recipe. She'd set the table with her regular dishes, saving the royal Worcester china for a more formal occasion. Throughout dinner, Derek talked about his work, his goals, his 5-year plan. Savannah gazed at him adoringly, hanging on his every word. They looked happy together. That should have been enough for Margaret, should have been all that mattered. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, some depth, some substance beneath the polished surfaces. After dinner, as Margaret was clearing the dishes, Savannah and Derek exchanged a glance, a wordless communication that Margaret couldn't interpret. Mom, sit down, Savannah said. We want to talk to you about the wedding plans. Margaret sat, her hands folded on the table, trying to ignore the anxiety twisting in her stomach. So, Savannah began, her voice bright and cheerful, Derek and I have decided to do a destination wedding. Isn't that exciting? A destination wedding, Margaret repeated slowly. Where? Maui. There's this incredible resort, the Grand Wiella. 5-star, right on the beach. We're going to do a whole weekend event. Rehearsal dinner Friday, wedding Saturday, farewell brunch Sunday. It's going to be absolutely magical. Margaret's mind raced. A destination wedding in Hawaii. That would be expensive. Flights, accommodations, the resort costs. That sounds lovely, she said carefully. But sweetheart, have you priced everything out? Hawaii is quite far, quite expensive.
We have a budget worked out, Derek interjected. With the fund and some of our own savings, we can make it happen. It'll be tight, but worth it.
I'll need to book my flight soon, Margaret said. What are the dates? Another glance between Savannah and Derek, longer this time, weighted with meaning. About that, Mom, Savannah said slowly. Derek and I have decided to make this an adults-only event. The words didn't make sense at first. Margaret blinked and fused. Adults only? But I'm an adult. I mean, it's going to be a sophisticated affair. Lots of activities, late nights, a beach party, nothing really appropriate for... at your age, Mom, the travel would be really hard on you. The realization hit like a physical blow. Are you saying I'm not invited to your wedding? Don't think of it like that, Savannah said quickly. Think of it as us being considerate. The flight is 6 hours, the time difference is difficult, all the events we have planned, beach volleyball, snorkeling, late-night dancing, it would be too exhausting for you. We're thinking of your health. Margaret's hands gripped the edge of the table. I'm 72 years old, Savannah. I'm not infirm. I'm perfectly capable of flying to Hawaii and attending my only daughter's wedding. But the activities... I don't need to participate in every activity. I just want to see you get married. Mom, please don't make this difficult. Savannah's voice had taken on an edge. This is my wedding, my day. Derek and I have the right to make it exactly what we want. And what we want is a young, fun, energetic celebration with our friends. No offense, but you don't really fit that vibe. Margaret looked at Derek, who had the decency to look uncomfortable, though he said nothing in her defense. Savannah, Margaret said, her voice shaking now, your father saved for 40 years for this wedding. 40 years. He worked double shifts, overtime, weekends. He worked himself to death building that fund for you. And you're telling me I can't even attend? The money was for my wedding, not for you to attend it, Savannah said, her tone cold now. Dad wanted me to have my dream wedding. This is my dream. If you love me, you'll respect that. This is cruelty, Margaret whispered. This is my choice, and I'm sorry if it hurts your feelings, but I'm not changing my mind. Derek and I have discussed it extensively, and this is our final decision. They'd left shortly after that. Margaret had stood at her front window, watching their car pull away, feeling like the ground had opened beneath her feet. Her daughter was getting married, and she wasn't invited. The wedding her husband had died building, she wouldn't even get to attend. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the conversation over and over. At your age, too exhausting for you. You don't fit the vibe. Each phrase was a knife, twisting deeper with each repetition. She tried calling Savannah the next morning. The call went to voicemail. She tried again in the afternoon. Voicemail again. She sent a text. Please, can we talk about this? I don't understand why you're shutting me out. The response came 3 hours later. There's nothing to talk about. My decision is made. Please respect it. Margaret tried a different approach. At least let me help with the planning. I don't have to attend, but I'd like to be involved. I have a wedding planner. Everything is handled. Savannah, please. This is breaking my heart. You're making this about you when it should be about me. Margaret set her phone down, her hands trembling. The days that followed were a fog of hurt and confusion. She went through the motions of her daily routine, working on alterations, grocery shopping, tending her small garden, but everything felt hollow. She'd call Daniel's grave sometimes, sitting in her car in the cemetery parking lot, talking to a headstone that couldn't answer. I don't know what to do, she'd whisper. I don't know what happened to our little girl, the one you built that dollhouse for, the one who used to hug your neck and tell you she loved you. Where did she go, Daniel? When did she become so cruel? The stone offered no answers, only silence. A week after the confrontation, Margaret tried one more time. She drove to Savannah's apartment, knocked on the door. Derek answered. His expression shifted when he saw her, discomfort mixed with something that might have been pity. Mrs. Chen, Savannah isn't... I know she doesn't want to see me, Margaret interrupted. But please, just give her a message. Tell her I love her. Tell her I just want to be part of her special day. Tell her I won't cause any trouble, won't interfere, just want to watch my daughter get married. Derek had shifted uncomfortably. I'll tell her you stopped by. Will you really? He'd met her eyes then, and in that moment Margaret saw the truth. This wasn't just Savannah's decision. Derek had encouraged it, maybe even initiated it. "Have a good day, Mrs. Chen," he'd said, and closed the door. Margaret had stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at that closed door, feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. 2 months passed. Summer arrived. Margaret's 73rd birthday came and went without a call from Savannah. She'd sent herself flowers and pretended they were from her daughter. She tried to move on, tried to accept that this was how things were now. Her daughter was getting married, and she wouldn't be there. She tried to make peace with it. She failed. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in July, her phone buzzed. A text from Savannah. Finally, Margaret's heart leaped. Maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe she'd come to her senses. She opened the message. No words, just photos. Dozens of them. It took Margaret's brain a moment to process what she was seeing. A beach, crystal blue water, white sand, a resort that looked like paradise. Savannah in a wedding dress, not just any wedding dress, a couture gown that probably cost $20,000, strapless with intricate beading, a cathedral train spread across the sand like a river of silk and pearls. Derek in a tuxedo. Guests in formal wear, laughing, toasting. Tables decorated with enormous floral arrangements, orchids and roses and exotic blooms Margaret couldn't name. Each centerpiece was a work of art. A multi-tiered cake that looked like architectural sculpture. A private beach ceremony with white chairs and an arch covered in flowers. A luau with a roasted pig and professional performers. Photos of a yacht. Savannah and Derek on the deck, champagne glasses raised, the sunset behind them painting the sky in impossible colors. More photos. Reception photos. Dancing photos. Candid shots of Savannah laughing with friends, surrounded by people Margaret had never met. And then the final photo. Savannah standing in front of a display board. Margaret zoomed in, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone steady. $78,400. Every penny. The exact amount in the wedding fund. The wedding had already happened. Had happened without her. Had happened using money that Daniel had died saving, and Margaret hadn't even known when or where. And Savannah had sent photos, not to share joy, but to gloat, to rub Margaret's face in it, to say, "Look what I did with your money. Look at the party I threw that you weren't allowed to attend." Margaret's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the kitchen table. She sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling something inside her crack. Not her heart. That had already been broken. Something deeper. Some fundamental belief about the world, about family, about the nature of love and obligation. When she finally moved, it was with purpose. She pulled her laptop out of its back, opened it with shaking hands, logged into her bank account. She navigated to the wedding fund, the Daniel and Margaret Chen wedding fund for Savannah. Balance, $0. Last transaction, June 30th. Complete withdrawal of $78,400. Authorized by Savannah Chen, power of attorney. Margaret stared at that screen for a long time. Then she made a phone call. "I need to speak with someone about unauthorized withdrawals from my account," she said when the bank representative answered. "And I need to speak with a lawyer. Today." The bank's fraud department took Margaret's call seriously. Within an hour, she was on a conference call with 3 representatives and a supervisor. "Mrs. Chen, I'm looking at your account history now," the supervisor said. "I see a series of withdrawals beginning 4 months ago, all authorized under a power of attorney held by Savannah Chen. Is that your daughter?" "Yes," Margaret said, her voice steady now. The shock had burned away, leaving something harder in its place. "But I didn't authorize these specific withdrawals. I never gave permission for her to access this account. The power of attorney on file gives her broad authority over your financial accounts," the supervisor explained. "It's a general, durable power of attorney, which means she doesn't need specific permission for individual transactions. The POA itself is the permission. I signed that power of attorney for medical emergencies, for end-of-life planning, not so she could steal my money. Mrs. Chen, legally speaking, if the power of attorney is valid and properly executed, the withdrawals aren't theft. They're authorized transactions." Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. "Even if I had no knowledge of them? Even if the money was specifically designated for a purpose that didn't include excluding me from the event it was meant to fund?" There was a pause. "Those are questions you'll need to address with a lawyer, Mrs. Chen, but I can tell you that from the bank's perspective, the transactions appear to be legitimate. Can I see the paperwork? The POA documents on file? We can send you copies." "Please do. Immediately." The documents arrived via email within the hour. Margaret printed them out, spread them across her kitchen table, and began to read.
It took her 3 attempts to get through the dense legal language, but gradually the picture became clear. The power of attorney she'd signed in the lawyer's office 2 years ago wasn't just for emergencies. It gave Savannah immediate, unrestricted access to all of Margaret's financial accounts, the authority to make withdrawals, transfers, investments, purchases, the authority to act as Margaret in all financial matters. Margaret remembered that meeting, remembered Jennifer, Savannah's lawyer friend, explaining everything so quickly, using terms Margaret hadn't understood. Remembered the stack of papers, the instructions to sign and initial each page. She trusted them, trusted her daughter, trusted the professional. And they'd used that trust to slip a document past her that gave Savannah exactly what she needed to access the wedding fund. The question was, had Jennifer known what Savannah planned?
When Margaret finished, Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Chen," she finally said, "I've been practicing family law for 30 years. I've seen children do terrible things to their parents. Financial exploitation of the elderly by family members is more common than people realize. But this, the cruelty of this, is remarkable." "Can we do anything?" Margaret asked. "The bank says the withdrawals were legal because of the POA." "The withdrawals might have been technically legal, but that doesn't mean they weren't wrongful. We can argue several things: elder financial abuse, breach of fiduciary duty, fraud by misrepresentation. The fact that you signed the POA under the impression it was for emergency medical purposes, not to give your daughter unrestricted access to your accounts. The fact that she took funds specifically designated for a purpose and then excluded you from that very purpose." Patricia leaned forward, her expression intense. "The biggest challenge will be proving that you didn't consent to the use of the funds for this wedding. Do you have any evidence that the fund was specifically designated? Documentation that it was for a wedding you were supposed to attend?" Margaret thought for a moment. Then she remembered. "The account title," she said. "It's called the Daniel and Margaret Chen Wedding Fund for Savannah. The name itself indicates its purpose. And I have years of bank statements showing the deposits, the growth. I have..." She paused, a memory surfacing. "I have my husband's notebooks. From when he first started the fund, he kept meticulous records. Every deposit, why he made it, what it was for, his plans for Savannah's wedding." "Get me those notebooks," Patricia said immediately, "and any other documentation you have, financial records, communications with your daughter, anything that establishes what this fund was meant for and how it was supposed to be used." "What do you think our chances are?" Margaret asked. Patricia didn't smile, but her eyes hardened with something that looked like determination. "I think your daughter got greedy and stupid. She not only took your money, she sent you photos bragging about it. That shows intent. That shows malice. And that's going to be very, very difficult for her to explain to a judge." "How long will this take?" "Months, maybe over a year. These cases can drag out. And Mrs. Chen, I need to be honest with you. Litigation is expensive. Attorney fees alone could run into tens of thousands of dollars." Margaret had expected this. She'd already thought it through. "I have some savings outside the wedding fund," she said, "and I have items I can sell if necessary, family heirlooms. I'll do whatever it takes." Patricia studied her for a long moment. "This isn't really about the money for you, is it?" Margaret met her eyes. "My husband died building that fund, died believing he was giving our daughter a beautiful gift. She took that gift and turned it into a weapon to hurt me. It's not about the money, it's about justice." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then let's get you some justice." Filing the lawsuit took 3 weeks of preparation. Patricia and her paralegal gathered evidence, built arguments, constructed a case that Margaret barely understood but trusted was solid. During those 3 weeks, Savannah tried to contact Margaret twice. The first time was via email. "Mom, I hope you enjoyed the wedding photos. I know you were disappointed you couldn't attend, but it really was better this way. The events were very active and wouldn't have been suitable for you. Derek and I are back from our honeymoon now, Bora Bora. It was incredible. We should get together for lunch soon. I have some things I need to pick up from your house anyway. Let me know when you're free. Savannah." Margaret had deleted the email without responding. The second attempt was a phone call that Margaret let go to voicemail. "Hey Mom, it's me. Haven't heard from you in a while. I know you're probably busy with your sewing stuff. Call me back when you get a chance. Love you." The casual tone, the breezy assumption that everything was fine, that Margaret would just accept what had happened and move on. It would have been infuriating if it wasn't so predictable. Margaret didn't call back. Instead, she did something else, something Patricia hadn't advised her to do, but hadn't discouraged either. She sold the heirlooms. She started with the Royal Worcester china. She'd had it appraised years ago for insurance purposes, $12,000 for the full set. She contacted a porcelain collector in Seattle who specialized in antique china services. He drove down to Portland, examined each piece carefully, and offered her $11,000 cash. Margaret accepted. She watched him carefully pack each plate, each cup, each saucer into boxes lined with bubble wrap. Each piece had memories attached,
Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, the time 5-year-old Savannah had insisted on helping set the table, and Margaret had nervously allowed her to carry just one plate. The collector loaded the boxes into his van and drove away, and Margaret felt nothing. Next was the Irish lace tablecloth. She sold it to a textile museum that specialized in antique linens, $8,000. The pearl necklace went to a jewelry estate buyer, $4,000. The sapphire ring, Daniel's mother's ring, was the hardest. That one she sold to a private buyer through an estate jewelry auction, $10,000. The crystal pieces went to various collectors and antique dealers, another $4,000 total. She kept a complete inventory of everything sold, every buyer's name, every receipt, documentation that these items, which Savannah had always claimed would be mine someday, were gone. The sales brought in $37,000. Some of that would go to legal fees. The rest Margaret put into a new savings account, one in her name only, one with no power of attorney attached. She felt lighter with each sale, as if she was shedding not just possessions but obligations, expectations, the weight of a relationship that had been dead for longer than she'd wanted to admit. While she was doing this, Patricia was finalizing the lawsuit. The charges were extensive: theft by deception, elder financial abuse, breach of fiduciary duty, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Patricia had built a compelling case. The evidence of the fund's purpose, Daniel's notebooks documenting his intentions, the fact that Savannah had excluded Margaret from the very event the money was meant to fund, the timeline showing Savannah had accessed the account through the POA shortly after becoming engaged. And then there were the photos, those damning, gloating photos that Savannah had sent. These photos are going to destroy her defense, Patricia said with grim satisfaction. They show intent, they show malice, and they show that she knew exactly what she was doing and took pleasure in hurting you. The lawsuit was filed on a Monday morning in September. By law, Savannah would be served with the complaint within a few days. Margaret spent that Monday in her garden, pulling weeds, planting bulbs for next spring, trying not to think about what would happen when Savannah received those papers. The call came that Thursday. "What the hell, Mom?" Savannah's voice was shrill with rage, loud enough that Margaret had to hold the phone away from her ear. "Hello, Savannah. You're suing me? Are you insane? I'm your daughter." "And you stole from me," Margaret said calmly. $78,000 that you had no right to take. "It was the wedding fund. It was for my wedding. How is it theft to use money for exactly what it was intended for?" "It was intended for a wedding I would attend, a wedding I would be part of. You took the money and used it for an event you specifically excluded me from." "Oh my God, you're still on that?" "Mom, we've been over this. It was an adults-only event." "I am an adult." "You know what I mean. It wasn't appropriate for someone your age." 73 is not ancient, Savannah. I'm perfectly healthy and capable of attending my daughter's wedding." "This is ridiculous. You're being vindictive and petty. I'm going to call this lawyer and get this dropped." "You can call her. Her name is Patricia Reeves. Her number is on the complaint. But she won't drop anything. This case is moving forward." "I can't believe you're doing this to me, to your own daughter, after everything Derek and I have been through planning this wedding." "Planning it with my money. Money you stole." "I didn't steal it. I had power of attorney. The bank gave me access." "You used a power of attorney that was meant for medical emergencies to access funds you had no right to touch. That's theft, Savannah, no matter how you try to justify it." There was a pause. When Savannah spoke again, her voice had changed. Lower, harder. "You're going to regret this." "I doubt that." "I mean it, Mom. You drop this lawsuit or you're going to lose me forever. Is that what you want? To lose your only daughter over money?" Margaret felt something break inside her, the last fragile thread that had still connected her to hope that her daughter might somehow change, might somehow become the person Margaret had once believed she was. "Savannah," she said quietly, "I lost you a long time ago. I just didn't want to admit it." "Fuck you." The line went dead. Margaret set down the phone and went back to her garden. Savannah's lawyer, unsurprisingly, was Jennifer, the same attorney who'd helped set up the power of attorney. Her response to the lawsuit was aggressive and victim-blaming. The defense argument was simple. Margaret had given Savannah power of attorney. Savannah had exercised that authority legally. The wedding fund was always meant for Savannah's wedding. She'd used it for exactly that purpose. Where was the theft? As for excluding Margaret from the wedding, that was Savannah's right as a bride. No one was entitled to attend someone else's wedding. The fact that Margaret's feelings were hurt didn't constitute abuse or emotional distress. It was a coherent defense. It might even have worked, if not for 3 things. First, Daniel's notebooks. Patricia submitted them as evidence, and they were devastating. Page after page of Daniel's writing, documenting every deposit, noting his dreams for Savannah's wedding day, his plans to walk her down the aisle, his hopes that she'd start her marriage with joy and without financial stress, knowing her parents loved her enough to give her this gift. The notebooks made clear that the fund wasn't just money for a wedding. It was money for a specific vision of a wedding, one that included the parents who had sacrificed to make it possible. Second, the timeline. Patricia's paralegal had done a detailed analysis of when certain things happened. The power of attorney was signed in June 2 years ago. Savannah got engaged in April this year. The first withdrawal from the wedding fund happened exactly 1 week after the engagement. That wasn't coincidence. That was planning. And then there were the photos. Patricia had them blown up, printed in full color, submitted as exhibits. She'd highlighted the display board. Total investment $78,000. Your Honor, Patricia had argued during a preliminary hearing, the defendant didn't just use her mother's money. She flaunted it. She sent these photos to Mrs. Chen, knowing she'd been excluded from the event. This isn't a daughter innocently using funds that were always meant for her. This is calculated cruelty. The judge, a woman in her mid-60s named Sandra Martinez, had studied those photos for a long time. Mrs. Chen, she'd said, looking at Savannah, why did you send these photographs to your mother? Savannah, dressed in an expensive suit and wearing her most innocent expression, had responded, I wanted to share my happy day with her, Your Honor. I thought she'd be happy for me.
You thought she'd be happy seeing pictures of an event that cost exactly the amount she'd saved for your wedding, an event she wasn't invited to attend? I thought she'd moved past that disappointment. Judge Martinez had looked at Savannah with an expression that suggested she'd seen through every word. This case is proceeding to trial, she'd said. Discovery begins immediately. Discovery was brutal for Savannah. Jennifer fought hard to limit what had to be disclosed, but Patricia was relentless. She wanted everything. Bank records, credit card statements, communications between Savannah and Derek about the wedding, the contract with the resort, receipts for every expense. And slowly, a picture emerged. The wedding hadn't cost $78,400. It had cost $78,400 exactly because that's how much was in the fund. Savannah and Derek had designed the wedding to spend every single penny. The dress, $22,000. The resort package, $35,000. The photographer, $8,000. The flowers, $6,000. The yacht excursion, $5,000. Every expense carefully calibrated to drain the account completely. Patricia discovered something else during discovery. Savannah had known about the fund's existence long before she'd admitted. She'd found bank statements when helping Margaret move to Portland. She'd seen the balance. She'd known, for years, exactly how much money was waiting for her. And she'd planned accordingly. The engagement to Derek had been fast, 8 months of dating before the proposal. But during those 8 months, Savannah had already been researching destination wedding venues, already getting quotes, already planning how to spend money she hadn't officially accessed yet. The power of attorney had been set up well before the engagement. Jennifer claimed it was for estate planning purposes, but the timing was suspicious. Savannah had pushed for those documents right around the time she'd started dating Derek seriously. Had she already been planning this? Had the power of attorney been obtained specifically to enable access to the wedding fund? Patricia couldn't prove it definitively, but she could raise enough questions to make a jury suspicious. And then Patricia discovered the emails. During discovery, Savannah was required to turn over electronic communications related to the wedding, and buried in hundreds of emails to vendors and friends was a thread between Savannah and Derek from 2 months before the engagement. Derek, how much do you think your mom has saved in that wedding fund? Savannah, at least $75K, probably more. She and my dad have been adding to it forever. Derek, that could pay for a seriously nice wedding, like destination wedding nice. I know, I've been thinking about that. Hawaii maybe, or Cabo? Would she let you use all of it though? She won't have a choice. I have POA over her accounts now. As soon as we're engaged, I can access the fund directly. Won't she be pissed? Probably, but what's she going to do? It's my wedding fund. The money is technically for me anyway. True, and if we do destination, we can make it adults only. Keep it just our friends. Exactly. No family drama, no obligation to include her just because she saved the money. When Patricia showed Margaret these emails, Margaret had to excuse herself from the conference room. She'd gone to the bathroom and vomited. They'd planned it. Months before the engagement, before Derek had even proposed, they'd discussed using the wedding fund without Margaret's permission, accessing it through the POA, excluding her from the event. It was premeditated, calculated, cold. The trial began on a cold morning in March, nearly a year after Savannah had sent those gloating photos. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with Patricia, her hands folded in her lap, trying to remain calm. Across the aisle, Savannah sat with Jennifer, dressed in a modest skirt suit that was probably intended to make her look responsible and mature. Derek sat in the gallery behind her, offering support. The courtroom was small. The proceedings would be decided by Judge Martinez rather than a jury. In some ways, this was better. A judge would be less swayed by emotion, more focused on law and evidence. But it was also terrifying. Everything rested on one person's assessment. Patricia's opening statement was powerful and concise. She laid out the facts. A father and mother who saved for 40 years. A specific purpose fund meant to give their daughter a wedding without financial stress. A daughter who used a power of attorney to access that fund without permission, spent every penny, and then excluded her mother from the very event the money was meant to fund. This isn't a case about a daughter innocently using money that was always meant for her, Patricia argued. This is a case about theft, betrayal, and calculated cruelty. Mrs. Chen didn't just lose money, she lost the ability to see her only daughter get married. She lost the dream she and her late husband had nurtured for 4 decades, and she lost it to a daughter who sent her photographs of her exclusion as a form of mockery. Jennifer's opening statement took a different approach. She portrayed Savannah as a young woman making difficult choices, trying to plan her dream wedding while balancing competing obligations. Savannah Chen loves her mother, Jennifer argued, but she also had the right to plan her wedding according to her own vision. The money in that fund was always meant for her. Mrs. Chen even told her daughter that. And yes, Mrs. Chen is hurt that she wasn't invited to the wedding. That's understandable, but hurt feelings don't constitute theft or abuse. This is a family dispute that should have been resolved privately, not weaponized into litigation. The testimony began. Margaret was the first witness. Patricia walked her through her history with Daniel, the creation of the fund, Daniel's death, the relationship with Savannah. She spoke about the power of attorney, how she had understood its purpose, how she'd never imagined it would be used to access the wedding fund without her knowledge. Then came the hard part, describing the destination wedding announcement, the exclusion, the photos. "How did you feel when you received those photographs?" Patricia asked. Margaret took a breath. Devastated, betrayed, like 40 years of my life, 40 years of my husband's life, had been reduced to funding an event I wasn't allowed to attend. "Did you give your daughter permission to withdraw the funds from the wedding fund?" "No, never. I didn't even know about the withdrawals until after the wedding had happened." Jennifer's cross-examination was sharp. "Mrs. Chen, isn't it true that you told your daughter the wedding fund was all for her?" "I told her it was for her wedding, yes. Not for a wedding you could attend, just for her wedding." "The implication was always, please answer yes or no. Did you specifically tell her the money could only be used if you were invited to the wedding?" "No, but did you specify any conditions on how the money could be used?" "No, however." No further questions. The exchange made Margaret feel small, foolish. Jennifer had made it sound like she had no right to expect anything. Patricia's redirect was brief but effective. "Mrs. Chen, when you and your husband saved this money, what did you imagine?" We imagined being there, walking our daughter down the aisle, or at least watching her walk, celebrating with her, being part of her joy. That was always the dream." "And when your daughter excluded you from the wedding, how did that affect the purpose of the fund in your mind?" "It destroyed it. The whole point was to give her a wedding without stress, to be there for her, to share in that moment. If I couldn't be there, then the money lost its meaning. It became just money spent on a party by someone who didn't care if I was there or not." Savannah testified next. She was polished, prepared, her answers carefully rehearsed. She spoke about her difficult childhood, growing up in a small apartment while her friends had bigger homes, about feeling excluded because her parents couldn't afford the things other parents could, about the pressure of knowing money was being saved for her wedding when she didn't even know if she wanted to get married. She portrayed her decision to have a destination wedding as a way to create something special, something that was truly hers, without the weight of her parents' expectations. "I loved my father," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "and I love my mother, but this was my wedding, my day, and I needed it to be about me and Derek, not about fulfilling some vision my parents had created before I was even born." It was a good performance, sympathetic, relatable. Then Patricia began her cross-examination. "Mrs. Chen, when did you first learn about the wedding fund?" "My parents told me when I was 13. "And what was your reaction?" Savannah hesitated. "I was grateful, but also confused about why they'd been saving all that money instead of using it to improve our living situation." "You were upset they hadn't used it to buy a bigger house?" "I was young. I didn't understand." "Did you ever come to understand?" I understood they were trying to do something nice for me." "Did you understand it was a sacrifice? That your father worked overtime, double shifts, weekends to build that fund?" "Yes." "Did you appreciate that sacrifice?" "Of course." Patricia pulled out one of Daniel's notebooks. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit 12. This is one of your father's notebooks, Mrs. Chen. Have you ever seen this?" "No." "Let me read you an entry from 3 months before he died. He wrote, 'Worked extra shift at the plant. Back is killing me, but deposited $200 into Savannah's fund. Up to $74,000 now. Can't wait to see her face when we tell her. Can't wait to walk her down the aisle.' Did you know your father was in pain from working those extra shifts?" Savannah's eyes glistened. "I knew he worked hard. Did you know he had a heart condition? That the stress of all that overtime contributed to his death?" Yes, I knew about his heart. And yet you took that money, every penny he died building, and used it for a wedding he would never see, that your mother wasn't allowed to attend. It's not like that. Then please explain what it is like. Because from where I'm standing, you took 40 years of your parents' sacrifice and turned it into a party for your friends. That's not fair. What's not fair, Mrs. Chen, is sending your mother photographs of a wedding you knew she wanted to attend, a wedding funded entirely by her money and your late father's money, with a caption bragging about the total investment. What was the purpose of sending those photographs? I wanted her to see how beautiful it was. You wanted her to see what she'd missed. No. You wanted her to know you'd spent every penny. I wanted to share my happiness. By rubbing her face in her exclusion? Jennifer objected. Judge Martinez sustained it. But the damage was done. Savannah looked flustered, defensive, less sympathetic. Patricia then introduced the emails between Savannah and Derek.
Mrs. Chen, is this an email exchange between you and your husband before your engagement? Savannah looked at the document, her face paling. Yes. Can you read the highlighted portion for the court? Do I have to? Yes. Savannah's voice was barely above a whisper. Derek asked, would she let you use all of it? And I replied, she won't have a choice. I have POA over her accounts now. As soon as we're engaged, I can access the fund directly. So you planned, before you were even engaged, to access your mother's accounts using the power of attorney.
It wasn't my mother's account. It was my wedding fund. A fund in your mother's name, created and managed by your parents, that you had no legal right to access without authorization. I had the POA, which you obtained under the pretense of emergency medical planning, correct? It was for estate planning. Did you tell your mother when you signed that power of attorney that you intended to use it to access the wedding fund? No, but I didn't know I'd need to at that point. But you obtained it just 6 months before you started dating Derek seriously. Interesting timing. That's coincidence. Is it? Because the emails suggest otherwise. They suggest you and your fiancé discussed accessing the fund using your POA before he even proposed. That sounds like planning to me. Doesn't it sound like planning to you? Savannah had no good answer. The trial continued for 3 more days. Financial experts testified about the withdrawals, the timeline, the deliberate spending to drain the account completely. Character witnesses spoke about Margaret's relationship with Daniel, their decades of sacrifice. Derek was called to testify. He was less prepared than Savannah, less polished. Under Patricia's questioning, he admitted that he and Savannah had discussed the wedding fund early in their relationship, that they'd planned a destination wedding specifically because they could afford it with the fund, that the adults-only designation was partly about keeping it intimate and partly about avoiding family drama. Drama like having to invite your fiancé's mother? Patricia had asked. I didn't mean it like that, Derek had stammered, but the meaning was clear. Closing arguments happened on a Friday afternoon. Patricia's was powerful, Jennifer's was defensive. And then they waited. Judge Martinez didn't take long. I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony, she began, and I'm prepared to issue my ruling. Margaret's heart pounded. This case has troubled me deeply, the judge continued, because it represents a fundamental breach of the trust that should exist between parent and child. Mrs. Chen and her late husband saved for 40 years, not because they were wealthy, not because it was easy, but because they loved their daughter and wanted to give her a gift. Savannah's face was pale. That gift was never just money. It was sacrifice, it was time spent away from family, it was physical labor that likely contributed to Mr. Chen's early death. It was, in essence, a manifestation of parental love in its purest form. Miss Chen took that gift and perverted it. She used a power of attorney, obtained under the guise of estate planning, to access funds she had no right to touch without explicit permission. She planned this access before she was even engaged, as the emails clearly demonstrate. And then, adding insult to injury, she spent that money on an event specifically designed to exclude her mother. The defendant argues that this was her right as a bride, that she had autonomy over her wedding plans. And that's true. She absolutely had the right to plan whatever kind of wedding she wanted, to invite whomever she chose. But she did not have the right to use her mother's money to do it, not without permission, not without discussion, not without acknowledging the sacrifice that money represented. The sending of the photographs was particularly egregious. It demonstrates not just indifference to her mother's pain, but active cruelty. The display board showing the total investment, the exact amount withdrawn from the fund, shows that Miss Chen knew exactly what she'd done and wanted her mother to know it too. The judge paused, looking directly at Savannah. This isn't about hurt feelings, as the defense suggests. This is about theft. This is about a daughter who saw her parents' life savings, not as a gift given in love, but as money she was entitled to, regardless of how she treated the givers. I find in favor of the plaintiff, Margaret Chen. Margaret felt her breath leave her body. Miss Savannah Chen is ordered to pay full restitution of $78,400. Additionally, she is ordered to pay $25,000 in damages for emotional distress and elder abuse. She is also responsible for Mrs. Chen's legal fees, which will be determined separately. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges related to elder financial abuse. Savannah made a sound like a wounded animal. This ruling is final. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. It was over. Savannah and Derek had 30 days to pay the judgment. When they failed to do so, Patricia filed for enforcement. The couple tried to negotiate, offered payment plans, claimed financial hardship, but Judge Martinez wasn't interested in excuses. You spent $78,000 on a single day, she noted during an enforcement hearing. You can find a way to repay it. Assets were liquidated. The wedding gifts, expensive kitchen appliances, fine dinnerware, crystal, were sold. Derek's sports car was sold. They borrowed from Derek's parents. They took out a loan. 6 weeks after the judgment, the full amount was deposited in Margaret's account. $103,400. The original fund, the damages, and interest. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, looking at the bank statement, feeling nothing. The money didn't bring Daniel back, didn't repair the relationship with her daughter, didn't erase the pain of those photographs, of being excluded from the weighing, of knowing that Savannah had planned the whole thing with cold calculation. But it was justice. Cold, hard, financial justice. Patricia called the day after the payment cleared. It's done. You won. Completely. How do you feel? Empty, Margaret admitted. I thought I'd feel, I don't know, triumphant, vindicated, but mostly I just feel sad. That's normal. This wasn't a victory anyone should have to pursue. You sued your daughter. You won. But what did you really win? The truth, Margaret said quietly. I won the truth. For 40 years I told myself that Savannah's entitlement was just a phase, that she'd grow out of it, that deep down she appreciated everything we sacrificed. Winning this case meant accepting that I was wrong, that she really is that selfish, that cruel, and there's a freedom in accepting the truth, even when it hurts. What will you do now? Patricia asked. Margaret looked around her small house, at the empty spaces where the china cabinet had been, at the bare table that used to wear the lace tablecloth, at her hands, unadorned now without the pearl necklace or sapphire ring. I'm going to live, she said. For the first time in years, I'm going to actually live. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after the payment. Margaret recognized Savannah's handwriting on the envelope. She held it for a long time, debating whether to open it. Finally, curiosity won. Dear Mom, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, about the lawsuit, the wedding, all of it. I understand now that you felt hurt by my decision to have a destination wedding. I understand that you felt excluded. That wasn't my intention. I was just trying to create something special for Derek and me, and I thought you'd understand. I know you're angry about the money, and maybe I should have talked to you before accessing the fund. But Mom, you'd always said the money was for my wedding. I used it for my wedding. I don't see how that's theft. Still, I don't want us to be estranged forever. You're my mother. I love you. And I know you love me, even if you're mad right now. The lawsuit is settled. The money is repaid. Can we please move past this? Can we please try to rebuild our relationship? I'm willing to forgive everything if you are. Love, Savannah. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Each time the words rang more hollow. I'm willing to forgive everything if you are. As if Savannah was the wronged party. As if Margaret was the one who needed forgiveness. She didn't respond. The second letter arrived a month later. This one was different. Mom, I don't understand why you won't talk to me. I've tried calling, I've written, I've eaten, I've been by your house, though you wouldn't answer the door. What do you want from me? I repaid the money. The court said I had to, so I did. What more do you expect? You're my daughter, your only child. Dad would be so disappointed in you for cutting me out of your life like this. He always believed in family and forgiveness. You're betraying his memory by refusing to let this go. I need to pick up some things from your house. The family heirlooms that are rightfully mine. Grandma's china, the lace tablecloth, Dad's mother's ring. I'm planning a dinner party next month for Derek's parents, and I want to use the good china. Please let me know when I can come by. Savannah. This letter made Margaret laugh. A bitter, painful laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. The heirlooms were gone. Sold. Scattered to collectors, museums, and private buyers. Margaret wrote back. The only response she'd sent to any of Savannah's communications. Savannah, the family heirlooms you reference are no longer in my possession. I sold them during the lawsuit to cover legal fees and other expenses. They now belong to people who appreciate them. Margaret. She didn't sign it Mom, didn't add love, just her name. The response came within hours. Not a letter this time, a phone call. Margaret let it go to voicemail. You sold them? You sold Grandma's china? Dad's mother's ring? Those were mine. They were supposed to be mine. How could you do that? How could you sell my inheritance? I'm calling my lawyer. You can't just sell things that don't belong to you. 3 more voicemails followed, each one angrier than the last. The final one was Derek's voice, trying to sound reasonable and failing. Mrs. Chen, this is Derek. Savannah is very upset about the heirlooms. Those items have significant emotional value to her. I'm sure we can work something out. Maybe you can tell us who you sold them to, and we can try to buy them back. Please call us. We really need to resolve this. Margaret deleted all the voicemails. Jennifer, Savannah's lawyer, sent a letter threatening legal action. Patricia sent one back explaining that Margaret had every right to sell her own possessions, that Savannah had no legal claim to items she didn't yet inherit,
and that any further harassment would result in a restraining order. The threats stopped, but the letters continued. Over the next year, Savannah sent dozens of them. Some angry, some pleading, some attempting to manipulate through guilt. "You're all alone now. Is that really what you want? I'm pregnant. Don't you want to know your grandchild? Everyone at church is asking about you. They think it's awful that you've cut me off. Dad would hate what you've become." Margaret read each one once, then filed them away in a box in her closet. Someday maybe she'll look back at them and feel something other than tired resignation. But not yet. Margaret's 74th birthday came and went wildly. She treated herself to dinner at a nice restaurant, then came home to an empty house that no longer felt quite so empty. She'd redecorated after selling the heirlooms. New furniture, nothing fancy, but comfortable in hers. She'd painted the walls colors she liked, soft blues and warm grays instead of the neutral beiges Daniel had preferred. She'd hung artwork she'd bought from local artists instead of family photos that made her sad. She'd created a space that was entirely her own. Her alteration business was thriving. Word had spread about her skills, and she had a waiting list of clients. She'd raised her prices, something Daniel had never let her do, always worried about being too expensive.
But the clients paid happily, grateful for quality work. The money from the lawsuit sat in her account, and Margaret decided to use it for something Daniel would have approved of. She traveled. First, the Grand Canyon. She'd wanted to see it for 50 years. She spent a week there, hiking the easier trails, watching the light change the colors of the rocks, feeling small and insignificant in the best way. Then Savannah, Georgia, not because of her daughter's name, but because she'd read about its beautiful historic district. She'd wandered the squares, toured the old houses, eaten at small cafes. New York City. She'd seen 3 Broadway shows and visited museums and walked through Central Park until her feet ached. Europe. London, Paris, Rome. Places she and Daniel had dreamed of visiting someday. She traveled light, stayed in modest hotels, ate at local restaurants. She met other solo travelers, women her age who'd also lost spouses, who'd also decided to finally live for themselves. She made friends. At a cooking class in Tuscany, she met Eleanor, a widow from Boston. They'd bonded over shared experiences, difficult children, sacrificed dreams, the strange freedom that came with finally putting yourself first. "My son hasn't spoken to me in 2 years, Eleanor had confided over wine one evening. I sold his childhood home, the one he'd assumed he'd inherit, and used the money to travel. He was furious, said I was spending his inheritance. It's not his inheritance until you're dead, Margaret had pointed out. Exactly, that's what I told him. I'm 76 years old. I spent 50 years raising him, supporting him, sacrificing for him. Now it's my turn. If he can't understand that, that's his problem, not mine." They'd clinked glasses, a toast to selfish children and the mothers who'd finally learned to choose themselves. Margaret returned from each trip renewed, energized, experiencing things she'd always dreamed of but never prioritized. Because there was always something more important. Daniel's comfort, Savannah's needs, the wedding fund, the future. But the future was now, and Margaret was finally living in it. One evening, while sorting through paperwork, Margaret came across Daniel's notebooks again. She'd looked at them dozens of times since the trial, but now she read them with different eyes. Not seeing the sacrifice, not seeing the dream deferred, but seeing a man who'd believed in something, who'd thought he was building something beautiful. He'd been wrong about what Savannah would do with his gift, but he'd been right about wanting to make a difference. Margaret made a phone call. "Patricia, it's Margaret. I want to set up a charitable trust. Can you help me with that?" "Of course. What kind of charity?" "Something that helps elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse by family members. Education programs, free legal services, resources to help them recognize warning signs and protect their assets." "That's a wonderful idea. How much are you thinking of funding it with?" Margaret looked at her bank balance, the lawsuit money, the sale of the heirlooms, her savings. "All of it," she said. "Every penny." There was a pause. "Margaret, that's over $150,000. That's your security." "I have enough to live on. The alteration business covers my expenses. I don't need much. But this money, it came from pain, from betrayal. I want it to become something good, something that helps people, something Daniel would be proud of." "Are you sure?" "Completely." The Daniel and Margaret Chen Foundation for Elder Financial Protection was established 3 months later. It was a small foundation, but well-focused. It offered free legal consultations for seniors concerned about financial abuse, educational workshops on powers of attorney and estate planning, resources for recognizing manipulation and coercion, a hotline for reporting suspected abuse, assistance in finding attorneys who specialized in elder law. Margaret sat on the board, used her story, anonymized but still her story, to illustrate the kind of abuse the foundation was meant to prevent. She spoke at senior centers, at community groups, at churches. She told them about trust misplaced, about warning signs ignored, about the importance of protecting yourself even from, especially from,
Family members. I loved my daughter, she'd say. I trusted her completely, and she used that love and trust against me. I was lucky. I had resources to fight back. Not everyone does. This foundation exists to help those who can't fight back on their own. The work was meaningful, healing in a way, taking her pain and transforming it into protection for others. Daniel would have liked that. Margaret lived 15 more years, good years, full years, years of travel and friendship and purpose. She never spoke to Savannah again. Savannah tried periodically, a card at Christmas, an email on Mother's Day, but Margaret never responded. She'd heard through distant relatives that Savannah had 2 children, a boy and a girl, that she and Daniel had bought a house in the suburbs, that she was doing well in her career. Margaret felt nothing at the news. No grandmothers longing to meet the children. No curiosity about their lives. Savannah's children were strangers, and Savannah had made it clear that Margaret's presence in her life was conditional on acceptance of unacceptable behavior. So they remained strangers. When Margaret turned 85, she updated her will. Everything, her modest savings, her house, her personal possessions, went to the foundation to continue the work, to help others avoid the betrayal she had experienced. At 87, she was diagnosed with cancer, pancreatic, aggressive. The doctors gave her 6 months. She declined treatment. "I've lived a good life," she told her doctor. "A full life. I'm ready." She spent her remaining months tying up loose ends, visiting friends, taking one last trip, to Hawaii, ironically, to see the island she'd been excluded from. She scattered some of Daniel's ashes there, in the ocean, kept her promise to the young man who'd worked so hard to provide for a daughter who'd never appreciated it. "We tried our best," she told the waves. "It wasn't enough, but we tried." 3 weeks before she died, Margaret wrote a final letter. She asked Patricia to hold it, to deliver it to Savannah after her death. Patricia had argued against it. Why give her anything, even a letter? "Because she's still my daughter," Margaret had said simply. "And maybe someday she'll understand what she destroyed. I want her to have the chance to understand." The letter said, "Savannah, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I imagine you're contacting my lawyer looking for your inheritance. So let me save you the trouble. There is none. Everything I had, my house, my savings, my possessions, goes to the Daniel and Margaret Chen Foundation for Elder Financial Protection, a charity I created to help people avoid the betrayal I experienced. The betrayal you inflicted. I know you think I'm cruel for cutting you out of my life. You've said as much in your letters over the years. You think I overreacted, that I was petty and vindictive, that I chose money over my daughter. But you're wrong. I didn't choose money over you. You chose money over me. You took 40 years of your father's life, every overtime shift, every missed dinner, every aching muscle. You took all of that sacrifice, all of that love transformed into dollars and cents, and you spent it on yourself without even allowing me to witness the moment it was meant to celebrate. You didn't steal money from me, Savannah. You stole your father's dream, his vision of walking you down the aisle, his hope that you'd start your marriage with joy instead of debt, his belief that sacrifice for your children was its own reward. And then you sent me photographs, not to share joy, but to wound, to show me exactly what I'd lost, to rub my face in my exclusion. That wasn't just theft, it was cruelty. I've spent 15 years since the trial rebuilding my life, traveling, making friends, creating meaning out of pain. I've lived more fully in these 15 years than I did in the 50 before them. And do you know why? Because I finally let go of the fantasy that you would change, that you would wake up one day and realize what you'd done, that you would genuinely apologize and become the daughter I thought I raised. You are not that daughter. Maybe you never were. Maybe I saw what I wanted to see instead of what was really there. I forgive you, Savannah. Not for your sake, but for mine. I refuse to die carrying the weight of anger and disappointment. You are not worth that burden. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it certainly doesn't mean I owe you anything. You wanted the family heirlooms? I sold them. The money helped fund the legal battle and later the charity. Pieces of our family history now serve a purpose greater than sitting in your china cabinet, displayed for guests who wouldn't know or care about their significance. You wanted your inheritance? I gave it to people who needed it more than you did. To elderly people being manipulated by their children. To victims of the same kind of betrayal you inflicted on me. Your father's legacy, and mine, is now protection for others, not wealth for you. I hope someday you understand what you destroyed. I hope you feel the weight of it. Not because I want you to suffer, but because I want you to grow, to become someone capable of genuine remorse, someone who understands the difference between entitlement and gratitude. If you do reach that understanding, I hope you'll use it to be better to your own children, to teach them what your father and I tried to teach you, that love is not measured in what you can take from people, but in what you're willing to give. I loved you, Savannah. From the moment you were born until the moment I understood who you really were, I loved you with every fiber of my being. That love wasn't enough. It couldn't change you. It couldn't make you value what mattered. But it was real, and it was worthy, even if you never were. Goodbye, Savannah. I hope you learn to be happy without taking from others. I hope your children never treat you the way you treated me. And I hope someday you understand why I had to let you go.